In the last video, we talked about Hinduism, and so this one will be about Buddhism. This is our second major world religion that we'll talk about in this unit. And Buddhism was, like Hinduism, born in India and within the culture of Hinduism. So, like Hinduism, Buddhism speculated on the existence of other worlds, the prospect of heaven or nirvana or paradise. Unlike Hinduism, though, Buddhism had a founder, a set of originating scriptures, and an order of monks. And we know the history of Buddhism, whereas with Hinduism, all we have are the Vedas, which don't really tell us when and where it began. One of the interesting things is that Buddhism opposed the Hindu caste system and the supremacy of the Brahmin priests. And that's probably one of the reasons why Buddhism did not last very long in India. So the founder of Buddhism was a guy named Siddhartha Gautama, born circa 563 BCE. And all that we know about his teaching and his life comes from his followers. And historians believe that the accounts of Buddha's life were embellished a little bit over time by his followers. But nevertheless, this is the history that is given to us, or that was handed down by his followers. Siddhartha Gautama was born to a wealthy warrior chief, so he would have been in the Kshatriya caste, and he lived in a large palace-like home. And his father had received this prophecy that Siddhartha would either become a great emperor or a great religious leader. And his father wanted him to become an emperor, not really a religious leader. So he sheltered him as much as possible. Well, one day, Siddhartha wandered outside of the walls of the palace, and by this point he was like 29 years old and was married and had an infant son. And so he wandered outside the walls of his home and went into the city and saw a frail old man. And Siddhartha had never seen an old person before, so he was almost traumatized by the sight of aging. So this led him to leave his wife and his son and his family behind and become an ascetic. And ascetics are people who reject all material culture. So he lived basically out in the woods, almost starved to death, for about 6 years. And during that time, he, in addition to almost starving to death, he meditated under a tree and reached enlightenment. And that is the ultimate goal of Buddhism, is for individuals to reach enlightenment or find the ultimate truth. And they believe that enlightenment just sort of hits you one day, and you are fully aware of the truth of the universe and your place in the universe. So in short, the Sangha, this is basically monks and nuns, or groups of monks and nuns. And the Sangha was open to all men, regardless of what caste they came from. And thus, the Brahmins were really angered by this because, of course, the Brahmins at the top of the caste system did not like for there to be no distinctions between caste systems, even within a religious sect. So, for a time, women were allowed to be in a part of the Sangha. They had their own convents, but only under special restriction. And today, the only Buddhist convents that exist are in Tibet. So these monks wore saffron robes and shaved their heads. They renounced alcohol and they didn't marry. But they did not have to take a vow of obedience to Buddhism because they were intellectually free and spiritually free to do as they wished. And early on, they wandered around and begged for their living. But as monasteries became richer and received more support, especially by the merchants who donated lots of money and land, the monks began to settle down. And they gave up begging, which actually diminished their contact with commoners. Okay, so there was a new sect of Buddhism that emerged around 100 CE, and it was more liberal in belief and practice. And just to give you an idea of how this differed from the previous form, or Theravada Buddhism, basically the difference was in the ultimate purpose of life and the way in which it can be attained. And Theravada Buddhists strive to be perfect saints who have attained enlightenment and nirvana. And this is considered to be possible only for monks and nuns who devote their entire lives to that task. So the best outcome for everyone else is just to be reborn into the monastic lifestyle. But with Mahayana Buddhism, they believe that everyone can become enlightened with a little help. And they have, with Mahayana Buddhism, this group of people called bodhisattvas, who they're saints who are almost perfect and who have almost become enlightened, but they unselfishly delay nirvana so that they can stay here on earth and help others attain it as well, like Siddhartha Gautama or the original Buddha did. So what type of sacred writings do Buddhists have? What do they read when they have their scripture time every day? There are a couple, but the main two are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And the Four Noble Truths are just four short truths about life that Siddhartha Gautama came up with. And the first one is, all of life is suffering. Nobody gets what they want out of life. You're plagued with pain from the time you're born. When you come out of the birth canal, you're in pain, and then aging, sickness, diseases, losing people, and then finally you die, and that's painful. So, number one, all life is suffering. The second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire, or us wanting something that we can't have. So number three, there is a way to end the suffering, and that is by learning not to have desires. And the fourth noble truth is that you have to follow the Eightfold Path in order to get rid of your desires. And just in short, the Eightfold Path says you need to have right understanding, right aspirations or the right motives, the right effort or actions, the right speech, the right conduct, the right livelihood, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. And so these are the two main Buddhist texts. And in addition to that, there is the Tripitaka, which is basically a list of the proper rules and procedures for Buddhist monks and nuns. And then the Mahayanas, which is the body of writings associated with Mahayana Buddhism, which is prominent in Tibet, Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan. So the decline of Buddhism in India. From the beginning of Buddhism, its strongest appeal was to the warrior class, or to the Kshatriyas. And they felt that the Brahmin priests did not respect them, keeping in mind that the Brahmin priests are one caste above the Kshatriyas. Also remember that the Buddha himself came from the Kshatriya family. His father was a warrior. But Buddhism began to lose strength in India around the same time that the Gupta Empire began to decline. And that was just partly because regional rulers began to choose Hinduism over Buddhism and began to have alliances with Hindu priests rather than Buddhist monks. Another thing that may have caused the decline is that with Mahayana Buddhism, they had a bunch of different godlike Buddhas, so it almost appeared to be extremely polytheistic. And they also had a multitude of heavens that seemed sort of close to what Hindus were already practicing. And on top of that, Buddhists throughout history had relied on Hindu Brahmin priests to officiate their Buddhist ceremonies of birth, marriage, and death. So Hindu priests could argue that they've always had a significant claim on Buddhist allegiance. Buddhism in China. So Buddhism in China appeared around 65 CE, and the first Buddhist missionaries to China traveled along the Silk Road. And after that, there were pilgrimages made by the Chinese to India to learn more about Buddhism, and all of them traveled along the Silk Road. So, relations with Taoism and Confucianism. We know that both philosophies were prominent in China during this time, so how did they mesh with Buddhism? Well, with the fall of the Han, Confucianism was discredited, which opened the door to Buddhist ideas. Mahayana Buddhism is similar to Taoism anyway, with its emphasis on nature and living simply. So Buddhism accommodated Taoism. And even though Confucianism received harsh criticism as the Han fell, Buddhism and Confucianism also accommodated each other. So in the 4 centuries of division in China, you've got the fall of the Han in 220, and then the rise of the Su in 551. So in that time, Buddhism continued to grow in the north and the south. And the founder of the Su was a Buddhist himself. And as we know from chapter 8, I think, also patronized Confucianism and Taoism, seeing all of those systems as vital to earning legitimacy for his government. And he wanted to appeal to all kinds of people. So he kind of combined Buddhism with Taoism and Confucianism to appeal to the people who were already there. So I'm not sure why Buddhism under the Tang, 618 to 907, is here twice. So we'll just look at that once. For the most part, Buddhism under the Tang dynasty flourished, and there were 8 major sects of Buddhism practiced under the Tang dynasty. And we won't go through all of those, but just know that Buddhism was thriving under the Tang dynasty. And the Chan sect taught the importance of meditation, and that's still widely practiced by Buddhists. Under the Tang, Buddhists invented woodblock printing. And there was even one woman who used Buddhism to make herself emperor of the Tang dynasty. So Emperor or Empress Wu, who ruled from 625 to 705 CE, used Buddhism to, legitimize her rule. So Buddhism's decline in China. There was one emperor toward the latter part of Tang rule called Emperor Wuzong, who feared the growing power of Buddhism and blamed it for the Tang's declining power. So in his fear and outrage, he began to confiscate Buddhist lands, he destroyed Buddhist texts, and he forced monks and nuns to leave monasteries and convents. So it really brought an end to Buddhism in China. Buddhism in Japan. So this slide is going to look at how Buddhism affected Japan. Initially, Japan's religion was Shintoism. Shinto means the way of the kami. It's also called Kami no Michi. And this is the religion of the natives in Japan. And it's like an action-centered religion that focuses on rituals that should be carried out with all care and diligence. And Shintoism today tries to make a connection between Japan today and Japan's ancient past. So who were or what was the kami? And this was really just anything that was divine or had a sacred essence. And that could be rocks, it could be trees or rivers. It was very nature focused. It could be animals or sacred places. And sometimes even people can said to have possessed the nature of the kami. And so when Buddhism came to Japan, the kami, or those things I just named, having to do mostly with nature, were seen as minor Buddhas while the Bodhisattvas of Mahayana Buddhism and the Buddhas were seen as major kami. So there was some merging that took place between the old religion, Shintoism, and the new one, Buddhism. So the Japanese royal family knew of Ashoka's adoption of Buddhism. We talked about the Indian Emperor Ashoka and how he had this violent campaign, and for 10 years he just engaged in brutal conquest of people and land. And after he converted to Buddhism, he had a 30-year reign of peace. While the Japanese royal family was aware of Ashoka and tried to imitate his action. So the Buddhism's arrival to Japan came by way of Korea in 552 CE. And its initial acceptance was tied to the belief that monks could work medical miracles. And so that was the belief that initially sparked interest with Buddhism in Japan. So it was actually Prince Shotoku Taishi, maybe, who reigned from 573 to 621 CE, who accepted Buddhism, and he saw it as a source for Chinese power, and he wanted that power source for himself. So he willingly accepted Buddhism and allowed it to shape and change Japan, which had actually served to unify Japan. So this was still a point in time when Japan was taking their cues from China. And so the ruling clans of Japan moved their capital to Nara in 710 CE, and they began to copy much of Chinese structure with administration, with language, with the way they tax the people, architecture, their land reforms, all modeled on the Chinese. So within Nara, the Japanese rulers began to build many Buddhist temples and gave them national significance, and they encouraged the creation of monasteries and convents. And so Buddhism, along with Shintoism, was used to supplement and uplift the government. So Buddhism actually facilitated Japanese centralization, and Buddhist wealth and power began to actually scare some of the Japanese as they gained more power. So in the same way that Buddhism took on different forms in China, it took on new forms in Japan as well. And so there were different sects of Buddhism that were being created. And there was the Saicho monastery that was placed far away from the powers of government. And they focused on the 10-day variant. And basically that just held that enlightenment was achieved by sincere religious devotion. The Amida favored chanting mantras, so they would repeat a phrase over and over and over to help them meditate. And then Zen Buddhism, which was the same as the Chan in China, emphasized defense of the state and the importance of martial arts. And so in looking at the lasting Buddhist elements in Japan, we see that they were able to cultivate an especially pure aesthetic dimension. So a focus on that which is beautiful and natural. There's also been an emphasis on the transience or fleetingness or the way that life passes away before our very eyes. And so you begin to see Japanese literature reflect this sense of transience, that life is short and it only lasts for a short time. And also the lasting impact has been that Buddhism has merged with Shintoism in Japan. And I know that we have 2 more slides that are going to flash up after I stop talking, but because we have already gone over, I will stop with this slide. I hope you guys have a great night.